My name is Evelyn Parker. I am the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at Perkins School of Theology, Southern Methodist University, and I hold the Susanna Wesley Centennial Chair in Practical Theology. Welcome to all of you who are joining us for this webinar on racism and Afrophobia. My colleague Sigma will say a word about the organization of this webinar and the persons who are hosting it.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us in this webinar. The webinar is organized by the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs of the World Council of Churches. This is a commission that celebrated its 70th anniversary last year and has been engaged in human rights issues over the past 7 decades, including racial justice. And last September, we organized a hearing on racism, Afrophobia, xenophobia, focusing primarily on the North American context. And as a follow-up of that rich conversation, we are organizing a series of webinars to continue the conversation in the North American context, but also in other parts of the world. So this webinar specifically is focusing on the US and North American context, and we're very happy to have all these distinguished speakers joining us for the webinar. Now to you, Evelyn.
Thank you, Sigma. I'd like to take this time to introduce our panelists, and we're very grateful that they've taken the time to join us and talk about this very important topic. I'll be introducing them in the order in which they will be speaking. And I first want to introduce Reverend Traci Blackmon. Reverend Traci Blackmon is Executive Minister of Justice and Local Church Ministries for the United Church of Christ, the United Church of Christ in the USA. She is Senior Pastor of Christ the King United Church of Christ in Missouri. And she is the first woman and 18th pastor of this 162-year-old church. She is, her first vocation was as a registered nurse, and she served as a registered nurse for more than 25 years in with healthcare experience. So she brings that to bear on her present calling as a person who is called to be the shepherd or the leader of a congregation in the UCC church. She has been very active in her region as well as in her denomination, and specifically during the situation with Michael Brown in the area of when he experienced the untimely death. She was very active in that as well as a leader bringing justice to that community. Followed by Reverend Traci Blackmon will be Dr. Ulysses Burley, and he is the founder of You Be the Cure, a proprietary consulting company on at the intersection of faith, health, and human rights. Ulysses serves as a member of the United States Presidential Advisory Council on HIV and AIDS from 2015 to 2017 under the Obama administration. He has been recognized by the National Minority Quality Forum as a top 40, under 40 minority health leader for his work in faith and HIV communities of color, and serves on the NMQF Advisory Board. Ulysses is a nationally recognized speaker and writer on topics including HIV and AIDS policy, LGBTQIA, gender and racial justice, food security, and peace in the Middle East. When Ulysses is not working or traveling, like on this snowy day in Chicago, he serves as a life-on-life mentor for fatherless teens in Chicago with GRIP Outreach for Youth program, where he is a member of their board of directors. Our other panelist is Dr. Jennifer Harvey, and she is a writer, speaker, and professor at Drake University in the USA. Her work focuses on racial justice and white anti-racism. Dr. Harvey's most recent books include Raising White Kids, Bringing Up Children in Racially Unjust America, which was published just this month, last month, by Abington Press, and a book titled Dear Christians, For Those Still Longing for Racial Reconciliation, which was published by Erdman's. Dr. Harvey is also contributes to the New York Times and the Huffington Post and is an ordained minister in the American Baptist Church USA. Our last speaker is the Reverend Dr. Sharon Watkins, currently serving through the National Council of Churches as director of its Truth and Racial Justice Initiative. She served as general minister and president of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the United States and Canada for 12 years, where she devoted her energy towards the wholeness of the church, reconciling differences and helping the church retain its clarity of mission and identity in a variety of religious and ecumenical settings. Upon her election in 2005, she was the first female head of a mainline denomination. She's a member of the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches and past chair of the board of the NCC, the National Council of Churches of Christ. I will stop there in terms of our introductions, and I would like to indicate that our first presenter will be Dr. Reverend Traci Blackmon, and she will focus for about 10 minutes on the topic, the intersection of racism, sexism, followed by Dr. Jennifer Harvey, who will talk about white supremacy and the difference between reconciliation and reparations, and then followed by Dr. Ulysses Burley on being a black man in the USA in 2018, and followed by him will be Reverend Dr. Sharon Watkins on the role of U.S. churches in addressing racial injustice. We're asking that you all speak for about 10 minutes, and we will move into questions after all of you all have presented. Reverend Blackmon?
Thank you, Dr. Parker, and thank you for the invitation, Sigma, to join you and this wonderful panel today to talk about such a critical issue. Prior to the call starting, we were asked to give our definitions of racism and Afrophobia so that our remarks can be located there. When I think in broad terms of racism, I think of the systematic and systemic targeting of people of varying hues and ethnicities that fall outside of whiteness in the United States. And when I think of Afrophobia, I think of the irrational and unearned fear, whether it is intentional or unintentional, of those who come from the African continent. That's very broad, but I think I will leave it there. I want to begin my comments about the intersection of racism and sexism by quoting Black feminist scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, who made the statement that the intersection of racism and sexism highlights the problematic consequence of our tendencies to treat race and gender as mutually exclusive experiences and analysis. When we insist on the bifurcation of human identities in single axis frameworks that ignore the complexities of intersecting targeted identities by centering the dominant culture in every category, then we by default begin to marginalize pieces of people in my understanding. For instance, what are the implications of such linguistic classifications of historically underrepresented groups when we routinely use phrases like people of color and women, right? Whether intentional or not, such phrases are loaded with subliminal imagery. By bifurcating these identities, one can easily receive subliminal messages that people of color designation refers solely to men in this gathering of things, and the women designation is predominantly white women. So when one says people of color and women, and that's just one example, where does it leave those of us who walk at an intersection of both of those things? Although this may not be intentional, it does highlight in a practical way the marginalization of women of color that easily happens when we use such phrases and cause such choices. Where is there space for the Black woman or the woman of color, the brown woman, the Hispanic woman, the women of African descent? Where is there place where we can bring all of ourselves and be fully seen? How are we to choose between our Blackness and our womanhood? And for those who've never experienced that, that may seem like a made-up argument for some, but I submit to you that right now I am in Memphis, Tennessee. I'm here with the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference that gathers annually a group of faith leaders to talk about justice issues. And we are in Memphis this year for a particular reason. That being that this is the 50th anniversary of the sanitation workers strike that happened here in Memphis. And also it is the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, which also happened here. And as we're commemorating these anniversaries, I am reminded, painfully so, of the roles of civil rights icons like Diane Nash, a lead strategist in the civil and human rights struggles of the 50s and 60s, and Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer and Rosa Parks and Prathia Hall, who first uttered the words, "I have a dream," and Ida B. Wells, who is classified even in historical documents as both a civil rights leader and a suffragist. I'm reminded of the leading role that these women played in that civil rights movement. And yet, both then and now, the diminished identities that they are given because of this false bifurcation that results in choosing a cause, right? What shall be my current focus? In spite of the prominence and permanence of Black women in the movement, the public characterization of the movement, both then and now, is male dominated. Likewise, the early suffragist movement did not include the cause of liberation for Black people. What piece of my identity, what piece of our identity must we liberate first? Our Blackness or our womanhood? It is because of such toxic bifurcation that one can have 62% of non-college educated and 45% of college educated white women vote for Donald Trump in the last presidential election, as compared to 90+% of Black women in both categories voting for the other candidate. What is the disconnect? The disconnect is often at this intersection. People of color, women of color, are forced to choose what identity will take precedent for them. In the 50s and 60s, it was believed in the civil rights movement that we must fight for Black liberation. We must fight for Black equality. And indeed, that is true. But there was a cost to that. And that cost was that the woman part was not often lifted up in the same way. If we had gone with the suffragist movement and fought for women's rights, then the question was, are you willing to fight for the rights of all women without consideration that we were not fighting for the liberation of Blackness? How does one make that distinction when both of those identities live within the same body? And so this is an issue, in my opinion, that we continue to have to address. 50 years later, yes, I'm here to commemorate those anniversaries, but as I look at the platforms of those who will be speaking, not just in Memphis, but also in other areas, they are largely dominated by male voices. If we're going to have serious conversation about what is the cost of bifurcating people's identities in this way, then we must be willing to address the inequities that still lie in this conversation. I am both Black and I am woman. I am both of those things at all times, and I am still fighting for a place where all of that is welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Blackmon. Jennifer?
Good day, you all. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be with you and to be on this really esteemed panel. I'm really humbled. I too would start with a definition of racism that is very similar to the one that Reverend Blackmon shared. When the word racism, I draw heavily on Beverly Daniel Tatum's definition, which is to understand racism as a system of unearned advantages and undeserved disadvantages, always with a white supremacist an unjust, enriched whiteness sitting on top of that. And so it's both ideology, but also practices and policies that support those ideologies and ideologies that enable those practices. And in terms of Afrophobia, I think of this too as a deep-seated kind of anti-Blackness that is both about fear, disparagement, erasure, that in many ways I think most of my work is in the US context, but it's very clear that the global white colonial settler project of the 1400s and 1500s and 1600s and on is the reason that in the US context racism exists, and Afrophobia sort of hones in on the extent to which the African continent and European engagements and violations of the African continent and African peoples emerged the racism and the white supremacy that we are contending with still in the United States, but also, of course, globally. So I'd like to share a little bit about the distinction between the reconciliation paradigm and a reparations paradigm. And I think this is particularly relevant and important in a conversation about church, because if we think about, here we sit in the year 2018, and for many white Christians in the US American churches, especially beginning in 2014 with the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, this kind of emerging awareness of how deeply alienated and still divided US American contexts are, including US American churches. And since 2014, this conversation, a conversation that's emerging among more white Christians who have perceived ourselves to be justice committed and God-fearing and God-loving and longing for beloved community, we have increasingly heard white Americans and white Christians recognize, how are we here? How are we still this alienated? And how are these structures and this violence still so pervasive? And I've been trying to think about and argue that we've spent a lot of time since the civil rights movement in especially Protestant church contexts talking about racial justice primarily through the vision of beloved community that was sacredly laid out for us by many civil rights activists, including, of course, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but that in white church contexts, we have embraced beloved community, but skipped the step of repair that is absolutely necessary for beloved community to be possible. So the reason this is so important is that it's very clear if we push a little bit on the notion of reconciliation, which is the framework that I think beloved community rests on, when we start talking about reconciliation as a paradigm, which is a lens or a shape, a framework that we look through, we talk about celebrating and embracing God-given differences. And what the problem with this is, what this erases is that whiteness is not a moral or a political or a spiritual or a cultural parallel to Blackness or Nativeness or Latino-ness. And if we only talk about our racial justice work through reconciliation frameworks, we're forced to sort of persist in this kind of strange, morally strange relationship to whiteness that tries to bring it in through the back door in a certain kind of way without really putting on the table the material, political, and historical truth about what whiteness is. So we sort of have to pretend that whiteness is a parallel to Blackness or Latino-ness or Nativeness, and it simply is not the case. So what I've been thinking about a lot is looking back in our own church history to the way power movements, Black power movements and Native power movements in the 60s, in the 70s, persistently insisted to white Christians that repair is actually the moral and theological moment that we are in, and that until we have repair, we cannot be reconciled. And so we can talk about 11 o'clock on Sunday morning being the most segregated hour of the week. We can talk about the ways we are racially divided, but those ways of talking about race miss the opportunity to name in a clear material way that repair, because of unjust enrichment and resources being wrenched from one communities and given to other communities and folks being boxed out in ways that have enabled the unjust thriving of some communities over others, those pieces have not gotten on the table in the way that they need to. And I think that theologically, in part in the church, that's because we've spent so much time talking about reconciliation, and what we really need to be doing is I think of it as a spiritual fast for white American Christians. We need to spiritually fast from that framework right now, not because I don't long for reconciliation, I do, but if I long for that, we need to engage in a spiritual fast from that and start talking about a reparations paradigm, where we look at models like Zacchaeus and say, oh, Zacchaeus had to give back fourfold from the ways he had been complicit in the oppression of the poor before he could go home with Jesus. And so I would like to be thinking and love some dialogue today about some of the ways that a reparations paradigm, where we put the material realities of white supremacy and colonial settler capitalism and how those mediate our relationships on the table as the work of the church.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harvey. Dr. Burley?
Thank you, moderator. And thank you to the World Council of Churches Commission of the Churches in International Affairs for this opportunity to share. My definition of racism is much like that of my sisters, but maybe even more specific in that, for me, racism is very much so an anti-Black prejudice or discrimination that is centered around a white supremacist power structure. And so I do believe that there's an element of power that exists centered around whiteness in this country. I view racism on both the macro and micro levels. I believe racism is very much a systemic and systematic paradigm in the United States, a macro-aggressive phenomenon, but as well an interpersonal microaggressive system as well. In terms of Afrophobia, simply anti-Black or an unsubstantiated anti-Black sentiment, be it for our brothers and sisters on the continent or those of us who are a part of the diaspora. This unsubstantiated fear of Black skin is how I would define Afrophobia. As a Black man living in the United States in 2018, life is definitely different for me. I appreciate having followed my sister, Reverend Blackmon, who talked about the intersection of racism and sexism, because I think oftentimes when we talk about racism in the United States, we center it around the experiences of Black men. And that does a disservice to our sisters who are also very much so experiencing anti-Black discrimination and racism on a large scale in this country. And it's oftentimes Black women who stand up, who fight for Black men. And sometimes that same action is not reciprocated. And so I appreciate her sharing first and being able to follow her as a Black man in the United States who can share my experience. I do not speak for all Black men. I grew up in an upper middle class family, two-parent home. Both of my parents were college educated professionals. I never had to worry about where my next meal would come from. I never had to worry about my safety. And my community was much like that of my own, surrounded by other African-American people who were very much so secure and insulated from the outside world. I didn't understand that I was a Black man and what that meant in the United States probably until well into my teens, until I left my very much so insulated and safe and protected community to experience the world and the country. And it's in those moments that I began to have the stories that we've all shared, the being followed around a department store, not because they want to assist you, but because they want to survey you because they think you might be stealing. It's being followed by police officers in your own neighborhood watching you pull into your own driveway and then questioning what you're doing there. It's being stopped by campus police as you are entering into your predominantly white institute to do your studies, and them questioning why it is that you are present. It is being detained in airports around the world because of the color of my skin or the amount of facial hair that I have. And so these are things that became apparent to me in my young adulthood. And it was then that I would have a direct experience with law enforcement on the basis of my race. I was once stopped by police officers in a case of mistaken identity. I had weapons drawn on me. I was put in handcuffs and placed in the back of a patrol car. And after the incident, the very first statement that the police officer made was, "We don't want you to think this was racial, but," and everything that followed that statement was that we received a report that there was a robbery in the area, and the only information that we had was that they were Black and that they were in a Black SUV. I still to this day don't know if that was true or not, but as a result of that, I was stopped. I was removed from my vehicle. My car was illegally searched. I had at least 6 guns drawn on me, and I was placed in handcuffs for no apparent reason other than the fact that I was Black in a nice car in a nice neighborhood. Since that event, I've obviously become more conscious and aware of both my Blackness and my maleness as I exist in the United States of America. And because of that, I have to govern myself accordingly. And so I have to be conscious about the way I present when I leave my home. Will I wear Air Jordans and a hoodie today, or will I wear a blazer and a collared shirt to protect my Blackness and my maleness? Is it okay for me to walk on the same side of the street as women, specifically white women, as I try and reach my destination just as they have, but to be conscious and aware of their safeties and their phobias and their prejudices? Maybe I should cross and walk to the other side of the street to save myself some grief. Should I play my music at a certain level when I drive my car to keep myself under the watchful eye of police officers and law enforcement officers? And so these are the realities of Black men in the United States in 2018, maybe even more now than ever under this current administration. And as a result of this reality, we've seen this phenomenon really play out in the Black Lives Matters movement, this movement against state-sanctioned violence against Black bodies, many of which have been Black men, but have also for sure included Black women. The United States has seen this surge in systemic racism, profiling, and discrimination of people of color, particularly African descent men, as a result of this police sanctioned violence, this police brutality. In 2012, when the Black Lives Matter movement was birthed and founded by Black women in response to the murder of a Black man, a Black boy, it was the inaction of the criminal justice system to properly prosecute the killer that really spurred on this movement. And so when we talk about racism in a systemic form, we talk about these systems that perpetuate certain advantages for whiteness and disadvantages for people of color, people who present like myself. On a very personal level, even today, I experience these microaggressive levels of racism, in that things like I attended Morehouse College undergrad, but I matriculated to Northwestern University for graduate school. So from a HBCU to a PWI. And it's often that when I travel, I will wear my Northwestern jacket. It says Northwestern across it. And there is not a time that I cannot remember being asked if I played sports for Northwestern University because of this jacket that I have on. And sometimes I dismiss the comment because I'm just not in the mood. And other times I assert myself and clarify that I have the jacket on because I attended medical school at Northwestern University and I'm a physician. And so then there's always the surprise, but I've even gotten comments as crass as, did you just like the jacket or did you really go to Northwestern? And I've got these comments as well from white people. And so these are things that I have to deal with on a daily basis, just as a result of my Black skin, from people who know nothing about me, who know nothing about my upbringing or my education or my faith. But even in spite of those things don't qualify me for a certain level of equality or equity. I shouldn't have to qualify myself as a Black man because I'm educated, because I had a good upbringing, because I don't have a criminal record. I should just be allowed to exist, be allowed to move about the country and the world freely as others have, and be allowed to not have to fear for my life against this white supremacist structure that has been, this country was essentially founded on as a result of the way I present physically. And so to conclude, 2018, we've made a lot of strides. The Black Lives Movement has really brought attention to an issue that has long been present, but now it's getting more mainstream attention. I am thankful for those sisters and their vigilance to fight for Black lives, and I continue to do so in my Black male skin.
Thank you, Dr. Burley. Reverend Watkins?
Hello. I want to also give my words of thanks for the invitation to participate. I'm grateful to my colleague panel. I learn from each and every one of you every time I hear you speak, and I have again today. It's really an honor to be here. I'm going to start in just a minute with some of the new Truth and Racial Justice Initiative of the National Council of Churches in the United States, and use some of that to organize some remarks. Starting with racism, the working definition that the Task Force for Truth and Racial Justice in the National Council of Churches is using is that racism is racial prejudice plus power, intentionally or unintentionally influence, oppress, and exploit others. Attitude, it's also the institutionalized form of that attitude and behaviors. This doesn't mention specifically white supremacy or white, but that is the assumption that in the context that we're talking about, racism is racial prejudice, power, and in the context of white supremacy. Afrophobia, we have not defined as a task force, but it is the unjust, ingrained fear and viewing of people of African descent and of the continent. So to talk a little bit about the National Council of Churches in the United States, the NCC, and the Truth and Racial Justice Initiative that we are launching. I'll start with a few years ago when the World of Churches, as part of the Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace, paid a solidarity visit to the United States, a solidarity visit with a focus on the state of race in the United States. It was a deeply pastoral visit, and it was deeply needed and much appreciated. The delegation visited Washington, D.C., where so many of the laws and court decisions get made, visited Charleston, the site of the horrific massacre of African American members by a white man in a church while Bible study. Ferguson, the site where an unarmed young African American man, Michael Brown, was killed by a police officer. Chicago, our major cities. In that place, a final debriefing was held. At the debriefing, the challenge was issued to the United States churches to organize a truth and reconciliation process on race in the United States, challenging us that the churches need to lead. And so we started to organize ourselves in that direction. As we talked, however, our attention focused more on the truth. Dr. Harvey has already spoken about the problems with the reconciliation paradigm at this time. For us, the problem was often the perpetrator, in this case, white people, want to rush to reconciliation, lingering at the truth and the repair. As one of our colleagues, the Reverend Andrea Alexander, said repeatedly, can we have reconciliation when we may have never had conciliation in the first place? And so we started calling our initiative Truth and Racial Justice Initiative. We eventually named it Act Now, Unite to End Racism. In that name, ACT, ACT, is an acronym for Awaken, Confront, Transform. We're going to launch the initiative on April 4th, 2018, which marks, as we've 50 years since the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We've invited people of all faiths and goodwill to gather with us on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., to commit to do the hard work to end racism in the United States. The National Council of Churches and its 38-member communions are not doing this alone. We have many partners. The World Council of Churches, which nudged us back into the struggle at this level, is one. Others, if you go to the website, www.rallytoendracism.org, you'll see a list of many partners. We're undertaking this initiative in the context of the UN's International Decade for People of African Descent. And so we're seeing this as a multi-year commitment. There are other currents, of course, to this movement, also church-led. Other activities happening in the United States on April 4th, many in Memphis, led by Church of God in Christ and others. And I'm hoping that many who are listening and watching today will join one of the gatherings. We especially invite you to be with the National Council of Churches and partners on the Washington Mall to recommit to finishing the work of ending racism in all of its manifestations. The rally will also be streamed. Can't get there in person, and we invite you to participate online. So briefly, then, the role of churches in addressing racial. Let me just mention a couple of things in the few moments I have left. First of all, the church's role is to be the conscience of the nation. And in a minute, I'm going to talk about what a poor job we have been doing in that role. At our best selves, followers of Jesus, we were called to love God and love neighbor. The very first story in the Bible, setting the stage for all that is to come, makes it clear that all human beings are created in the image of God, all. Jesus' inaugural address in Luke calls us to do justice for all. The church, when we are true to our nature, is about justice in the tradition of Jesus and the whole Bible. So the church's role is to be the conscience, to frame anti-racism as a moral issue, not as political correctness, as some would devalue it. Conscience. Second of all, the role of the churches is to tell the truth about racism. Churches of color, of course, and some predominant churches have been telling the truth for a while. People who experience the reality of racism every day are well able to explain and describe this evil. Sadly, for some, there's a prior step to telling the truth. For many, predominantly white churches, the step before telling is learning to see the truth to tell. The National Council's Act Now to End Racism initiative will include assessment instruments for churches to use to learn how racism is real in their lives and policies and procedures. Sometimes predominantly white churches literally don't see how complicit we are. Churches also have a role in truth telling because there's so many ways that the church itself has helped to create this horror. We haven't just been complacent, we've been complicit. From the doctrine of discovery, even before that, but certainly from the doctrine of discovery, allowing the whole era of colonization to turning a blind eye in the American enslavement of humans from Africa, or actually participating in the slave trade and justification, and continue in a system of white supremacy today, white people, and including white churches, are and have implicit. Even deeper, though, even deeper than that, what I heard Alan Busak recently call the weaponization of the Bible against people of color, the use of biblical interpretation and theology to allow and justify the most egregious of human offenses against human. We have to go deep enough to learn to tell the truth about what in our theology has allowed, even blessed, racism, white supremacy to flourish in the United States and globally. This call to tell this truth is profound and urgent. So this is all what we're talking about when we say awaken, the role of the to awaken, to be the conscience in all humility, because so much of the church has so much of our own work to do, to tell the truth on so many levels, and then to actually get active and to be involved in change, in righting wrongs, in repairing damage. The role of the church is also to help us confront the wrongs and work to right them. The focus for the NCC initiative is telling, but also then on moving to action. We've had statements of confession before. We're talking about calling ourselves to a true repentance. That means a seeing, a telling, and a movement of actual change. In the US, we worked hard decades to work through legislation predominantly. We now see that that's not enough. We're learning to our horror, legislation can be rolled back because racism is systemic and system-wide. We have to work on it on all fronts, all at once. The National Council envisions work in our hearts and faith communities through assessments and audits and relationships, as I've already said, but also through work in areas where racism affects us and intersects with the various institutions and activities of life: economic, social, environmental, criminal justice, in education, immigration, and the media. It just has to be a kind of a full court press, is what we think. It has to be about action, and it has to be outside the walls of the church. Before I ever met Reverend Traci, I was on a phone call with her. She wouldn't have known I was there, and a bunch of other clergy talking about Ferguson and about the actions taking place. And I remember her saying, as I remember what she said, was that young people were asking the clergy and the churches, so why are you here? Why are you here now? Where were you before, when we needed better schools, better healthcare, jobs? So these young people weren't even looking for the church to help them now or be present or come alongside. I remember one of my disciples' colleagues who was active with young people in the streets, Deetra Wise Baker, calling for justice, saying to the church gathered at a point inside the walls, I heard her say, "Come out into the streets with me and meet Jesus there." The role of the church then is to confront racism in the church and outside of the church, to be the church inside the walls, and then follow Jesus outside the walls into the streets, to the courthouse, to the voting booth, to the schools, to the workplace. In summary then, and just to start on what the role of the churches might be, the role of the churches is to awaken, to confront, and then to believe that God will transform us into the equitable and whole community that God had in mind for us all along. May it be so.
Thank you, Reverend Watkins. Thanks to all of our panelists. I'm going to offer a question that I hope will get us all talking together, and then we can invite our audience to offer questions as well. Reverend Blackmon, I appreciated you, what I'm calling the role of women who had been instrumental in the civil rights movement, going from Diana Nash to Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, Prathia Hall, and others. I also appreciated Reverend Dr. Harvey, your focus on reparations, as well as your experiences, Reverend Dr. Burley, as a Black man that also has an intersection of being race, class, and gender. That those intersections, as well as what you're saying, Reverend Watkins, about what the church is poised to do. And I'm using that word poised to do intentionally, because this is a movement that is forthcoming. So here is what this is the question that I want you all to respond to, as well as to talk to each other about. So specifically, as we think about women who are increasingly being incarcerated, but there's not always a focus on women who are being, particularly African descended and African American women who are being incarcerated in the USA, and the issues around that in terms of reparations that we might concretely focus on, Reverend Harvey. How is the church active in this, and where are people who are focusing more on men being incarcerated in this whole conversation? So I'm bringing together this whole issue of women, the problem of incarceration, and its relationship to being a person of color, being African American, African descendant, as well as where is the church in all of this. So hopefully this kind of gets at all of your different perspectives and that you offered in these opening remarks. Is that clear?
I think so. So you can redirect me if my response makes clear that I'm not hearing clearly. But I think I would want to respond, and I imagine the other panelists have much to say about this as well. So when I think about reparations, and what I say to a lot of church communities, especially predominantly white church communities who are seeking to be engaged in racial justice locally, is that reparations, to my mind, must include those of us who've been unjustly advantaged or given greater access in prioritizing time, resources, energy, and capacity building in the work of justice. And so in terms of your question around incarceration,
follow up in terms of your email.
We have someone in the background, so if we can ask those persons to all
around trying to gather the men at General Council. So, sorry.
I'm trying to mute the person, but I can't see the person.
Okay.
So whoever is speaking, please mute yourself.
I think it's muted now.
Yeah.
So I'll just say two.
Okay. So let me give you, and I'll on my end,
sir, we can still hear you. Can you mute yourself?
Forward your email to the
Mr.
folks who have a better sense of who is.
Yes, done. Sorry.
Excellent, thank you. So if I think about my local context, one of the things that some churches are increasingly committing to in partnership with historically Black congregations here in Des Moines is very concrete measures to seek to interrupt. The initiative here has been really focused on the school to prison pipeline. And so white Christians in Des Moines are sort of rising to the challenge that African American people in Des Moines have laid out relative to the need to get very concrete and specific about stopping the ways police are engaged in our public school system, and to commit time to getting trained as mediators to support youth in navigating conflict, and to put political energy into lobbying the public school system to agree to not call police when youth are having conflict that can really be supportively engaged with a mediator. However, I would say, I think, Dr. Parker, there's a significant gap still around the gender piece, because I do hear the language, at least here in Des Moines, mostly thinking about especially Black male youth, which of course is critically important, but we know we have horrific disparity rates in Iowa relative to the incarceration of Black women as well. So I think that's an area that needs more attention here. And the other gender piece I'll just throw in before I turn over the mic is that when I think about the gender piece, I think one of the biggest pieces of work for me and the communities I'm part of is really insisting on digging into what Reverend Blackmon noted around the incredible complicity of white women that the gender piece around race in white communities has really been pushed on in terms of white women's complicity with these really nefarious systems, including, as we saw in the election of the current president. So the gender piece for me is complicated and really, in terms of, it's really underdone, at least when I look at the local context here that I am part of in the role of the churches.
Thank you. Others, if you will respond?
I'll jump in. I want to use a biblical narrative as a way of thinking about this, and I am very grateful for this question. But in the Gospel of Luke, I believe it's the 13th chapter, there is the story of Jesus healing a woman who has been crippled for 18 years. The text says that she's so bent over that she cannot even see straight to look up, right? And she enters a synagogue where Jesus is teaching. And in the midst of this teaching, the text says that Jesus stops teaching and notices her. I'm adding the notices, but that's what comes out of the narrative. And he calls this woman to himself. He calls her to where he is. And when I first began studying this text, I was interrogating it from a piece of all the times that Jesus could have gone to someone who made her way into the synagogue, who was present in the midst of what was going on, in the midst of this gathering, of all the times Jesus could have taken the time to go over to this person, why make her walk even further to come to where he was? That was my thought. I was kind of enraged by that, actually. And the more I began to look at it, I noticed what was happening in calling her to the center. In that text, Jesus does indeed heal this woman, and the text says that she straightens up. But before she straightens up, in the process of coming to the center, Jesus declares that she is healed. Jesus declares she's healed before he straightens her up. That's important to me because I believe that Jesus was giving a model of what it means to bring people back into community. That in the calling her forward, into stopping business as usual, even if that is the teaching and the proclamations that come out of our sacred gatherings. When we stop doing what we've always done and pay attention to those who are at the center of the pain, then restoration and reparations are possible. Reparations and restorations cannot happen by those who are in privileged positions deciding what is needed by those who are being targeted and hurt. And I believe Jesus gives us an example, since this is a faith gathering, of paying attention to those who are most in pain, calling them to the center of the gathering, reestablishing their place in community. He doesn't call her woman after he brings her forth for healing. He calls her daughter and establishes her place in that community. What I would suggest to you, Dr. Parker, that you are raising is that anytime we approach any issue without a special lens for those who are at the center of the pain we are trying to heal, then they are marginalized, even within racial contexts. So yes, we talk about males who are being killed by police, but women are dying by police as well. We talk about males who are being incarcerated, but women are the largest growing population in the prison industrial complex. We do this because we don't want to stop business as usual and pay attention to those who are being bent over. In that text, in that particular text, it says that she is bent over by a spirit. And Jesus never declares that that spirit is internal or external, simply that it has pressured her to a point where she cannot even look up anymore. This is where the intersection of sexism and racism resides, when women must choose whether or not they want to be present as a person of color and ignore the specific needs of women in that situation, or whether we want to be present as women and be accused of denying the communal cause of all people of color. That's what you're talking about. And there must be particular attention given to women at these intersections. That must happen. And the first step towards reparations is the acknowledging of the uniqueness that we have even within these broad categories. When women are incarcerated, it is not just the women that are incarcerated, but oftentimes it is the children that are left without parenting. It has a ripple effect in our society. And the majority of women who are incarcerated, let's just not leave this out, are incarcerated for nonviolent crime, and oftentimes crime of abetting their male counterparts. So it's a tangled web. But if we're going to do this work, we have to begin to do it there. Reparations at this point in our lives, in my opinion, won't happen on an individual basis. But there are systemic reparations that can begin to change the generational outlook of people who have been historically targeted.
Thank you. Dr. Burley or Reverend Watkins?
Thank you, moderator. I want to take responsibility as a Black man. I understand that this conversation is about racism and Afrophobia, so subjugation on the basis of my color. But I also understand that I still enjoy male privilege. And oftentimes, Black men have not used our privilege to uplift our Black women, not in the same way in which they have held us up and propped us up. And so I think a part of this, as we talk about misogyny and sexism and intersections, is fighting for the cause of our sisters the same way in which they have fought for our cause. And that just hasn't happened. We're always hearing about Black women saving everybody all the time. And my question becomes, who then will save Black women? And it's been clear that it won't be white men. It's been clear that it won't be white women. And so far, it hasn't been Black men either. And so as the only male participant of this panel, as a Black man, I think we need to take responsibility as it relates to both the issues of women, but also when we talk about reparations and reconciliation, these aren't just things that are relative to the white population. We owe our sisters a great deal of what they've given us. And so there has to be some responsibility on the part of Black men, even in the case of our own discrimination and prejudice and subjugation, to not contribute to that of our Black sisters.
Thank you. Reverend
Yes,
Watkins?
so thank you. Following up a little bit on Dr. Burley's comments, as a white woman, I had some of the sentiments also of just needing to say a word of the need of white women to take responsibility and to begin to pay more attention to what happens at the intersection of race and gender, and to just grow in our understanding of our privilege and in working through what it means to be part of repair. As Reverend Traci was telling the story of the one woman, I was thinking of another woman in Jesus, the one who in the midst of the crowd reached through the crowd to touch the fringe of Jesus' garment. You know, he didn't reach out to her. She's the one who made it happen. And I think of Black women in that story, again and again, being the one who wants to make it happen, and of how we all are called to be able to all of us take our own responsibility. I appreciated the practicality of the story of Des Moines, of working to figure out the ways to make reparative justice actual, and how we continue to struggle even as we move forward in our efforts. I think the only other piece that I would add to this is the importance of all of us continuing to call each other to account. These conversations are important beyond conversation, but really the need within church settings and other settings, but I'll name church settings in particular. This needs to be the context where we can be excessively honest and direct with each other, that where we can create a space that is safe to be able to say the truth, and then to be able to commit to each other that we will find ways to act on it. And I hope that's a little bit of what we're doing here, but the work is so hard, and so that we need each other to be able to do it. And part of that is calling each other to account in absolute honesty and authenticity.
Thank you. Thank you all for responding to my question. Very thoughtful and helpful comments. And I like the practical perspective that you all have brought to that response. We have a question that is coming from, I think, Catherine or Kathleen Ellington. Is that correct? If you can ask your question now.
Yes, I have unmuted you, Catherine. Catherine?
Catherine Ellington, is that correct?
Yes.
Please ask your question. We welcome you.
I can read out her question. In dismantling leadership is required, how do church leaders work beyond the church to call for a moral obligation against racism? Can you say that again, Evelyn?
Just repeat the question again, please.
If dismantling leadership is required, how do church leaders work beyond the church to call for moral obligation against racism?
Any of our panelists want to approach that question or address that question?
Maybe I'll just start by saying that that we have to find the ways to do that. It's the partnerships across the various areas of society that are going to begin to make the difference. And so the church moving outside the church walls is just a necessary piece. We have to hear from our partners who are of other faiths and of other kinds of institutions and organizations. And as we learn from each other, we will get stronger. So I think the partnerships are so important. The things that we've said about listening to and learning from and accepting the leadership of people most impacted is important here. So that even the question about leadership from the church, my mind goes to a group of people if I think of, quote, church leaders. So I even have to move my own thinking immediately to resituate who is leading in situations like this, and that the people who lead need to be the people most impacted, and that we experience that as we partner outside church walls, and as we get out in the streets, as we get out into the various places where reform needs to take place, and develop those partnerships, and then that's how we begin to find the ways. That's where I would start that thinking.
Thank you, Sharon. I have another question on the line from Karen Thompson. If you can ask your question, welcome, Karen.
Good morning. Karen Georgia Thompson with the United Church of Christ. And my question, so there was some lifting up of the history, right? And the church has a history that is tied to the vilification and commodification of African people. It was the church that provided the theological justification for the enslavement of Africans and for saying that Africans did not know God and for naming Africans as people with no soul. This history is often ignored, and yet it is very present among us in the ways that some white communities still see African descendant people. How will white Christians and Christians in general confront this history and its manifestations in our world today? And how do you envision this history being a part of the discourse on reconciliation, repair, and reparations? And what does action around this theological reframing look like?
Okay, thank you for your question. Let's take it, let's kind of pull it apart. Your first part of that question is a reaction to the history that you just recited for us, just reminded us about. Is that correct, Karen?
Yes.
Okay, and then, so I'll ask the panelists to respond to that, and then we'll move into the other parts of your 3-part or 4-part question. Reverend Blackmon?
I'll start. I don't have a reaction to the history because the history is what it is. And Karen is speaking the truth about that. It is what it is. I would suggest that the church must begin, before we get to reparations or reconciliation, with repentance, with an acknowledging of our theological malpractice, with a deconstruction of a theology of chosenness that we have not only perpetuated, but we have embedded even deeper in our existence, with a reframing of not just our voices, but all the way through to the architecture of our churches, with an acknowledgement that the creation of humankind has its roots in African soil. I think we have to have some repentance around the ways that we have constructed a white God to promote white supremacy in this world. And the church is responsible for that. So the church must be the first to repent. And without that repentance, any talk of reconciliation and reparations is not genuine or authentic. So it's my expectation, if the church is going to do this work, and I'm talking particularly about the white church, if we're going to do this work, that it must start with that acknowledgement and that repentance.
Yeah.
Others would like to respond? Who would like to respond?
Can I build on that as well? I agree with that wholeheartedly, and I think the call to repentance is deeply rooted to learning the history. And so, if I may, I want to get very concrete and local again, and talk about a little about the Diocese of Maryland, where the history that the person who asked this important question raises shows up in really specific local context relative to the church. And in the Diocese of Maryland, starting in about 2000 or so, a task force that was appointed on reparations there, or convened, spent years, 4 years, 5 years, maybe 6 years, learning the history of the diocese, learning, digging for the names of the enslaved African peoples who built their churches. And what happened in that context was that this committee was composed of African-American Episcopalians and white Episcopalians, and there was a profound reckoning with that history that created, and they're still going through, the white Episcopalians in that diocese practices and ritualizing repentance, and it's really strongly linked to having learned in the concrete their own history in that diocese. And in terms of then, a piece of that work then too has been, they also didn't just learn that themselves, they went church to church and taught churches, especially the white Episcopalians in the diocese, their own history in a way that was difficult. Many communities did not want to hear that history, but they insisted that they would declare that history. And over time, and that hard work of really learning the history, naming the history, proclaiming the history, lamenting and repenting that history, you know, an ethos has developed in regard to which move towards repair is now part of the conversation in a very explicit way, but it is not abstract. It is not just in the mind and theological. It's on the ground in terms of taking seriously the history and the material realities and legacies of that history today in the Diocese of Maryland. So I think that's, you know, that history and the repentance go hand in hand with then the ways repair can begin to become more clear. And again, in deep agreement with centering the voices of those who are most in pain, have been most harmed in the past and in the present and ongoing.
I agree with that, with the remarks of my sister. I also want to lift up, though, that while we do much great work on local levels, I am really issuing a challenge to the heads of communion, to the heads of denominations, not instead of, but absolutely essential to. I am talking about doctrines and documents being created just as the doctrine of discovery was created, doctrines that acknowledge the theological malpractice that has happened in this country, in this world, that has impacted the lives of people of color from generation to generation. I'm talking about acknowledging the evilness of that from the top of religious institutions.
Yes.
Thank you. Any follow-up, Karen?
I'm sorry, I keep muting my phone, so it takes me a little while. No, this is fine. I know that there are multiple parts to the question, so I'll have you keep going.
Okay. I think we did get at some of the parts in terms of how do you envision the history being a part of the discourse on reconciliation, repair, and reparation. Somewhat, I think that our respondents gave some answers to that. Maybe we can circle back around to that, but I want to invite some other questions that we might have from our audience at this time.
We don't have any other questions so far. So,
Okay.
but I'm inviting participants to raise their question and participate in the conversation.
In light of this question that Karen has given us, I'd like to invite some of our other panelists. We've had two to respond, Jennifer and Traci. So Sharon and or Dr. Burley, do you have any comments on that? Ulysses, Sharon?
Sure. One of the areas in which I've been most critical of the white church of Black victims, I would say, is around what I call Black forgiveness. And so as there's been this kind of commodification of Black pain has taken place. And if we look at the Mother Emanuel shooting and Dylan Roof, and you know, one of the first acts of the families of the victims was, you know, whether or not they would forgive Dylan Roof. You know, everybody wanted to know, you know, well, will you forgive him? And it always seems as if in the midst of Black pain, people of faith always look for us to be forgiving people. We never ask that or require that of white Christians. And I think that there is a reason for that. I think as been stated, theology, the sacred text has been used to enslave people of color. And then to have those same slaves forgive their oppressor. And that continues to be perpetuated, I think, throughout faith spaces today, where we continue to expect Black Christians to forgive the wrong that has been done against them. But we never expect or require the oppressor to be contrite or to experience a certain level of guilt. And, I believe this is a part of the church's perpetuation of a white supremacist theology that continues to be used to control and subjugate people of color, that continues to justify white supremacy, racism, and the like. This idea around forgiveness. Do you forgive me? Do you forgive them? And I think we need to be asking our white brothers and sisters if they experience contrition. Do they feel guilty? Are they sorry? Are they apologetic? As opposed to expecting or requiring Black Christians to extend this level of grace that we have not been recipients of.
Yeah, if I could just say a word to say that the degree of white cluelessness, starting with my own, is just always startling to me. The things that I have not known blows my mind. Dr. Harvey, your book, Dear White Christians, taught me so much that I wasn't aware of about the construction of whiteness, about just some of the historical ways in which white supremacy has been intentionally and specifically and for nefarious purposes against people of color constructed and made. It wasn't an accident. So the amount of just historical information that white people have to learn is astonishing. And I continue to be astonished in myself of what I don't know. So why do I bring that up? I bring that up to say that that calling ourselves to account as white people and then as people, but for we need to just be calling ourselves to account to do the work to learn what's going on and what's been going on. To understand what it means that this is systemic and system-wide and historical and generational. To understand that it's more even than a system and processes and procedures, which in itself comes as news to many, but to learn and understand what it means and to grapple with the idea that the very theology that we have depended on is itself a perpetuator of white supremacy. These are things that we have got to, as white people, insist that we learn and keep learning and go deeper and deeper. Because yes, repentance is necessary to acknowledge and change. I mean, beyond the statements of confession that we've had, we have to keep going deeper, keep learning more, keep getting more historical, keep getting more theological, so that we even understand what it is to repent of. I mean, sometimes our intentionality about repentance is so shallow because we don't even have the sense yet of what is actually been going on and what we're a part of. So I think just holding ourselves accountable for learning, telling the truth, saying the truth, communicating the truth, so that we can get deeper and deeper to the bottom of this, to be able to actually know what needs to be repaired, is just key and critical. And again, I go to the piece that we simply have to keep holding each other accountable and being willing to be held to account.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you also, Ulysses. We have about 5 minutes more before our time will be, before we must end this webinar. So I want to pose a question to you all, and the question is more about the practical ways that we can go forward from this webinar with some intentionality around how we will address racism and Afrophobia. So here's my question. There is a concern among many that this work of dismantling racism and white supremacy be one that we lock arm in arm, Black, white, brown, all people of color, and do this work that we're called to do. But I am going to ask specifically, based on your own intersecting selves, that is, being white and clergy and middle class, as well as Black female, Black male, middle class, from your own social location. Tell me, what does this work require of you? And let me be a little bit more concrete. I've been in conversations recently where there is some leaning towards European Americans, white people, working on this issue alone, without the presence of Black people, so that there won't be this feeling guilty or feeling shame, or asking Black people to help us with our problem. And on the other hand, I've been in situations where there are persons who want Black people to join them, white people want Black people to join them in this process of dismantling racism, which for me is problematic. But I want to hear, in terms of your own social locations, as well as where you are called to do your work, what does this look like for you? Who should be at the table, and what does it look like? So is my question clear? I just want to make sure.
Yeah.
So I'm open to your responses as we kind of move to closure here.
Okay, well, I'll dive in then. I love that question so much, because I think it really exposes this deep paradox that white supremacy has created, where we need to be constantly looking at both ands. Because on the one hand, so what I feel called to do is to deeply and persistently, in relationships of profound accountability with people of color, and in my life it has tended primarily really to be with Black women, in both collegial, activist, friendship relationships, all type of relationships, to do the both and work of pushing and calling and equipping and teaching about whiteness, yes, in white communities, to white communities, but from my mind, that work, there is work that white people particularly need to do more heavy lifting relative to the anti-racist, anti-white supremacy work that everybody is needing to be about, but communities of color are already deeply engaged in. But I also think, and so white folks do need to do our own work, but to my mind, that isn't necessarily white only work. There are people of color who don't trust us to do that work, and for good reason, and so want to be present there as we do it, and excellent. And there are also people of color who know we need to do that work and say, you know what, I deal with this all the time. You go do that work. I don't want to bear that burden. And so excellent. And so the both and is, we do need to focus on whiteness, but that doesn't have to be white only work. It can happen in a number of different spaces, but it always has to be in actual, real accountability relationships with organizations led by people of color, both at the local level and at more national and institutional levels, all the time. And resources and justice work is externally focused, has to also be on board while that kind of anti-racist education work is happening, so it doesn't only become navel gazing.
Others?
I view this work as a three-legged stool. I think that this is an and. I believe that there is white people's work that white people have to do. I don't believe that white people always know what that work is or articulate it well. I believe that the core of that work is the liberation of white people for white people, not the liberation work on behalf of Black people, but on behalf of white people who are more tormented and more oppressed by this white supremacy than we ever talk about. I also believe that there's a leg of that stool for Black people, for people of color, who have to do our own work to recognize how we have been impacted and infected by white supremacy, to come to the realization that we, and only we, have the power to liberate ourselves. And then I think there's a third leg of this stool that is work that we do together. And we can't even really begin to approach that third leg until we come to a place of recognizing that white people do not do liberation work to save Black people. White people do liberation work to save themselves. And Black people coming to a realization that we don't need white people to be liberated. We're not living in that time anymore. The collective power and strength of people of color in this nation and in this world can turn this with or without white people. That is the fear. Most people think that we are living in a time of raging and rising white supremacy. I would suggest to you that this is not the rise of white supremacy. This is the death rattle of white supremacy.
Amen.
Like it or not, the world is browning. And for the liberation and the salvation of all, we must come to that acknowledgement. My personal contribution to this is deeply rooted in my call by God to preach and proclaim the gospel. And I believe that the church self is in need of salvation, is in need of a revolution. And I believe that I am one of many voices who have been called to do that work in the church. The church not as defined by a building, the church defined as the gathering of community, whether that's in a sanctuary or in the streets. Those of us who have said yes to the call must begin to proclaim the truth about racism. That's what I think.
Thank you. Others?
I echo Reverend Blackmon and Dr. Harvey's sentiments. I believe collectively, I don't believe racism is or should be solved by the oppressed, by those who are victims of racism. I do believe that there is a burden among white people that has to be carried with our accompaniment. As mentioned, this work is a part of my daily life. I don't have a choice. And I think for those who do have a choice, specifically white people, the choice has to become more and more clear that they too have to carry this on a daily basis, the same way in which I do, the same way in which I have to. It's not something that I can just put down and pick back up when it's convenient. And I think that the same has to be true for our white allies in this effort to destabilize white supremacy and to end racism. And so there's a level of togetherness, but I think there's a level of responsibility from our white brothers and sisters that has to be owned about being less non-racist and more anti-racist, as opposed to people of color continuing to bear this burden alone. It's not my burden to fix that which is against me, and so I do think that there's going to have to be some tough work together. I'm encouraging, and I'm especially thankful and grateful for Dr. Watkins, Dr. Harvey, the work that you are willing to do in your spaces, and just asking you to continue to use your platforms, your voices, to rally your communities. Because at the end of the day, you have access to them more so than I do. You have agency with them more so than I do. Oftentimes, the people who need to do the work the most, the people who need to hear these messages the most are the people around, your Thanksgiving tables, your Christmas tables, your family reunions, and things of that nature. So there has to be a level of ownership from all of us. There has to be an understanding of the intersections that we talked about, not just across discrimination of women, but also how race intersects with the LGBTQ population, and you know, and the just kind of really understanding that this is not just a black and white issue, but there are many arms, many fingers that have to also be realized in order for us to do this work effectively. Personally, again, as a black man, I think it is incumbent upon me to recognize that I still possess a privilege within my maleness, and that I need to not only use that privilege to liberate myself, but to use that privilege to liberate women, to liberate sexual and gender minorities, to liberate people who are not of the dominant faith in this country. And so for me, it's continuing to not be burdened by racial discrimination and prejudice, but to be strengthened and uplifted by the privileges that do favor me, and not only fighting racism, but fighting sexism and fighting violence and fighting poverty and fighting discrimination against LGBTQ people. And so I will continue to use that privilege, use the platforms that I've been given to not only speak on my behalf, but on the behalf of others who are also being marginalized.
Sharon?
So I think for me, as a very privileged person, just beyond even just being white, but the privileges that I've had in my life and the privileges of leadership, I think the challenge for me personally is to acknowledge the power that I have. My tendency is to want to not acknowledge it. And so on the one hand, it's to acknowledge the power and opportunity that I have without then flopping over into a white need and desire to control with that. There's this very moment where you move from acknowledging, okay, I can do some things, to wanting to control some things. And so trying to find the space there that is the right space. I spent time working overseas for some years, and always we said, you know, you people who aren't from here, if things get bad, you can always leave. And so how do I live my life person trying to be part of this movement for justice and wholeness? How do I stay in it without taking the ticket out of there if things get tough? I think that's another thing that stays with me as a challenge. And then as a white woman, to working for racial justice within a particular context. How do I then not perpetuate that very separation that Reverend Traci talked about at the very first? I mean, I just see myself falling into that trap of being either in white or working for racial justice and women left behind. And so that out of this, I take with me too, that part of my next step is to be ever more vigilant that are involved in the conversation, to the extent that to make that all the while learning about what is mine to do and what is not mine to do, when to try to jump in and be proactive, and when I need to step back and out of the humility that of learning just my right space in society and in the world, to know when it is to give voice and when it is to give ear. I'm grateful for everything that y'all have said in this last. I'm going to remember the three-legged stool. I'm going to remember the all of the complexity that Dr. Harvey has described, that all happens all at the same time. And Dr. Burley, just that we all are called to stick in here, to stay in here, doing the piece that is given to us. So I'm just grateful to all y'all for this conversation.
I'm grateful to all of you, our panelists. I am grateful to our audience who have been watching and listening in, and also to you, Sigma, and the World Council of Churches for making this webinar on racism and Afrophobia possible. Thank you, thank you, thank you very much for your contributions. And as I bring this webinar to a close, here's my challenge. This weekend, Black Panther starts. It's going to be in the movies across the country. And I will, as being charged by my 19-year-old nephew, awaiting the Black Panther movie. I got my ticket. I finally got one. I got it. I couldn't get it on the opening day, but I got it for Saturday. And also, as a person who teaches persons who will be pastors or who are already pastors here at Perkins, I've been in conversation with some of the students, particularly Black students, about the Black Panther. And so I'm going to the Black Panther movie, and I'm going to be looking for the theological themes, because I think it holds promise for this conversation, actually, as we connect with other generations who don't think the church is serious about what the church is called to do. So that's my challenge to you. Join me in getting your ticket to the Black Panther. Yes.
Happy to know that our church has bought out an entire theater to take all of our young people. Superhero Saturday coming up at the Black Panther.
Awesome.
Yes. Wonderful, wonderful. I think it has all types of theological implications for all of our work, particularly the work of the church. Maybe the church needs to look at this new way of thinking about church as Marvel brings us the Black Panther. And trust me, I think the audiences is going to look like all of us on this webinar. So thank you all. Thank you very much. And my prayers is you go forward to do this good work.
Thank you very much, everyone. This is the end of the webinar. We are going to make the link available on YouTube so that the conversation can continue in the coming days as well there. So I'll be sharing the link within 2 days or so, I hope. Thank you very much for the speakers. I'm very humbled and grateful, and also for all the participants for making time to join us during this important conversation.
Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Parker.
Thank you.
God bless.